I still can't get over what I witnessed while writing this story. Tell me what kind of man drives a luxury car into the woods, leaves a leather briefcase on the ground, and speeds off without looking back. And what if that briefcase wasn't filled with documents or money, but a living, breathing child, no older than 5, curled up inside like she was nothing? Her name is Grace. She's deaf. She doesn't speak. But her eyes have seen things no child ever should. And the only soul who heard her silent cry was a Rottweiler named Cooper, a dog who chose to act when no one else would. This story doesn't just chill you. It claws its way under your skin, because it's not just about abandonment. It's about betrayal, corruption, and the dark things that happen behind the gates of perfect lives. I want to know what you think. What would you have done if you'd been the one to find that case? Do you believe animals like Cooper feel something more? Something human? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Watch till the end, because there I have a little treat for you. And now, come back to this story and see how it plays out. The rain was a relentless curtain, a merciless downpour that had transformed the dirt track of Redwood Creek into a treacherous quagmire. Each drop seemed to hammer against the black luxury sedan as it clawed its way forward, the oversized tires spinning, then catching, then spinning again in the thick, sucking mud. Inside, the air was taut with a silence more oppressive than the storm raging outside. Victor Beaumont, a name synonymous with sprawling construction empires and ruthless business acumen, kept his gaze fixed on the barely visible path ahead. His knuckles were white where they gripped the leather-clad steering wheel, a display of unnecessary force. The expensive timepiece on his wrist, a subtle glint in the dim dashboard light, showed it was nearing midnight. Not another soul, not another vehicle, disturbed the isolation of this God-forsaken stretch of wilderness. Everything, he noted with a grim satisfaction, was proceeding exactly as he'd meticulously planned. In the back, Grace, a child of perhaps 4 years, shivered. The thin pink dress she wore, a frivolous splash of color against the grim night, offered no protection against the biting chill that seeped into the car, nor against the fever that had her small body in its grip. Her face, flushed a dangerous red, would occasionally contort in a brief grimace of discomfort, a silent testament to her misery. Confined to the cargo space behind the rear seats, Cooper, a powerfully built Labrador retriever, was a study in escalating anxiety. He whined, a low, guttural sound of distress, and his claws scrabbled lightly against the partition. His dark, intelligent eyes, glimpsed in the rearview mirror or through the narrow gap he strained to peer through, were fixed on Grace, reflecting a profound unease. Victor flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror, his gaze lingering on the child for a beat longer than necessary. Her light brown hair, damp with sweat, clung to her forehead. When her eyelids fluttered open for a moment, they revealed irises of a startling emerald green, an exact, haunting replica of her mother's. That resemblance, once a source of pride, now twisted something cold and unpleasant deep within him. It was a constant, unwelcome reminder. The sedan lurched onward for several more agonizing minutes until Victor spotted his pre-selected landmark, a small clearing, partially veiled from the track by a dense thicket of overgrown rhododendrons and ferns. He slammed on the brakes. The heavy vehicle slewed sideways, tires screaming in protest as they lost purchase, before lurching to a final, jarring halt. For a long moment, Victor sat perfectly still, the only sounds the deafening tattoo of rain on the car roof and the ragged cadence of his own breathing. He could feel the tremor in his hands. A slight vibration he willed away with an iron clench of his jaw. "This is better," he murmured, the words a barely audible whisper meant only for himself, a desperate self-reassurance. I cannot allow a child An imperfect child. To tarnish my reputation, my legacy. The word imperfect hung in the air, heavy with unspoken judgment, with movements that were decisive, almost practiced. He pushed open his door and stepped out. The wind-driven rain hit him like a physical blow, instantly plastering his expensive suit to his frame. But he barely registered it. He strode to the rear door and pulled it open. Grace, small and frail, offered no resistance as he lifted her into his arms. She was too weak, too consumed by the fever that had raged for days, to fight or even question. From the back of the car, Cooper erupted into a volley of frantic barks, thrashing against his confinement, a desperate plea for intervention that Victor ruthlessly ignored. He carried her about 20 yards into the dripping forest, his imported leather shoes sinking deep into the sodden earth with each step. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. He selected a spot between two ancient, gnarled trees, their branches forming a skeletal canopy against the bruised sky, and gently, almost reverently, placed Grace onto the damp, cold ground. Her eyelids fluttered open again, confusion clouding her fever-bright eyes. Her tiny hands, guided by a primal instinct, reached out, fumbling for purchase on his sodden jacket. Victor recoiled as if stung. He backed away quickly, a strange, unwelcome knot tightening in his own chest, a sensation he immediately and angrily suppressed. He turned his back on the small, discarded figure and strode back towards the looming silhouette of the sedan. Never once looking back, reaching the car, he yanked open the rear passenger door, or perhaps it was the trunk, the detail lost in the maelstrom of the moment, intending to toss out the small, cheap duffel bag containing Grace's meager belongings. It was a careless, almost contemptuous gesture, but in that brief instant of the door being ajar, Cooper, with an explosive burst of speed and agility that belied his size, bolted from the vehicle. He was a blur of fur and desperation, landing heavily on the muddy ground. The Labrador didn't hesitate. He positioned himself defiantly between Victor and the shadowy spot where Grace lay, a low, menacing growl rumbling deep in his chest. His gaze, fixed on Victor, was unwavering, a silent accusation. "Cooper, get in the car. Now." Victor's voice was a harsh, cutting command, laced with fury. He was not accustomed to disobedience, least of all from an animal. The dog held his ground. For a heart-stopping moment, an internal struggle played out in those intelligent canine eyes. Then, with a final, challenging look at Victor, Cooper turned his broad back on the man and trotted purposefully towards Grace. His intent was clear, absolute. He would stay. He would protect. Victor stared after the dog, his face a mask of cold fury and a strange, twisted sort of contempt. Foolish animal. He spat, the words snatched away by the wind. "Stay then. You can die with her." He wrenched open his car door, slid behind the wheel, and gunned the engine. The tires spun, spitting mud and stones, before finally biting into the track. The luxury sedan fishtailed wildly and then surged forward, disappearing into the rain-lashed darkness, leaving behind a small, feverish child and her loyal protector in the heart of the raging storm. Abandoned, Grace shivered violently, the cold seeping into her bones, the fear a palpable entity coiling in her stomach. She tried to push herself up, her small arms trembling with the effort, but her legs wouldn't obey. The fever had stolen her strength, disoriented her. The world tilted and spun around her in a dizzying, blurred kaleidoscope of shifting shapes and oppressive shadows. Though she could not hear the roar of the engine as Victor's car sped away, Grace had been born into a world of silence, her ears unable to perceive sound. She felt the vibrations through the damp earth as the vehicle departed. A primitive, terrifying understanding settled within her. she was alone. She had been left. Her small legs buckled completely, and she collapsed into the cold mud, consciousness rapidly fading into a merciful blackness. The very last image her eyes registered, before darkness claimed her, was a large, dark shape. Cooper, cautiously, purposefully approaching through the relentless curtain of rain. Cooper reached her side, his warm breath misting in the cold air. He nosed her gently, a soft whine escaping him as he felt the unnatural heat radiating from her fragile body. With an astonishing gentleness for an animal of his size and power, he lowered his great head and carefully, tenderly, took the hem of her sodden pink dress between his teeth. He licked her small, feverish face, a futile attempt to rouse her, his tail thumping once, then twice, against the muddy ground in a gesture of reassurance that went unseen. When she remained unresponsive, Cooper lifted his head and began to bark, a series of loud, urgent, resonant calls that echoed through the storm-tossed trees. His barks were not random. They were directed, imbued with a desperate intelligence, a clear attempt to attract attention from somewhere, anywhere. Beyond the oppressive darkness of the woods, he made a short, frantic dash towards a faint, distant glow he perceived through the trees, a glimmer of hope in the oppressive blackness, then raced back to Grace's side, nudging her again before repeating the pattern bark. Run a short distance towards the light. Return. His powerful paws, guided by an unerring instinct, found the safest path between the looming tree trunks, deftly avoiding fallen branches and treacherous, hidden stones. He was a beacon of determined loyalty in a world that had just shown its cruelest face. Not too far away, perhaps half a mile as the crow flies, the Monroe family farmhouse stood as a sturdy, if somewhat battered, sentinel against the storm. In the barn, a single lantern still glowed, casting a warm, inviting light. Eliza Monroe, a woman whose compassion extended to every living creature on their land, always left a light burning for the livestock on nights like this. It was a small comfort against the fury of the elements. Inside the cozy farmhouse kitchen, Eliza was helping her father, Samuel, secure a rattling window pane. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain lashed against the glass with a furious intensity. Suddenly, Eliza froze, her head cocked. "Dad," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm's cacophony. "Dad, do you hear that? That barking? It sounds strange. Not like any of the dogs around here." Samuel Monroe, a man weathered by years of working the land, paused his hammering and listened, his brow furrowed. The sound, faint but distinct, carried on the wind, a series of desperate, insistent barks, cutting through the roar of the storm. He nodded slowly. "You're right, Liza girl, it's close. And urgent." A prickle of unease, sharp and undeniable, ran down Eliza's spine. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with a dawning apprehension. "I think something's wrong, Dad. Terribly wrong. Can we go check, please?" Samuel hesitated for only a moment. The rain was still coming down in sheets, a relentless deluge, and the wind was a malevolent force. But the urgency in those barks, the sheer desperation they conveyed, was impossible to ignore. He met his daughter's worried gaze and nodded. "All right, girl, get your coat and the big flashlight. Let's go see what's got that poor creature so riled up." Together, they donned their heavy rain slickers, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and braced themselves as they opened the farmhouse door, stepping out into the teeth of the tempest. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly silent, save for the incessant dripping from the eaves of the farmhouse and the distant rush of an engorged redwood creek. But the barking, when it came again, sliced through the pre-dawn stillness, more insistent now, closer. The beam of Samuel's heavy-duty flashlight cut a swath through the lingering mist that clung to the trees at the edge of their property. Cooper, materializing from the shadows like a spectral guide, bounded towards them, his barks changing from urgent summons to something akin to joyful relief upon seeing them. His tail, a sodden plume, thumped a frantic rhythm against his flanks, but there was no time for leisurely greetings. He quickly turned, a low whine rumbling in his chest, and darted a short distance towards the dense, dark woods, looking back as if to say, "Hurry, this way. He wants us to follow." "Dad," Eliza said, her voice tight with apprehension, pulling her rain slicker closer as she pushed a stray strand of damp hair from her face. Samuel nodded, his expression grim. "Stay close behind me." "Liza," with Cooper leading the way, his barks now softer, more encouraging, they plunged into the dripping, tangled undergrowth. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick mud, fallen leaves, and hidden roots. The air was cold, heavy with the scent of pine needles and wet earth. Cooper, despite his obvious distress for the child, moved with an uncanny certainty, weaving through the trees, occasionally pausing to ensure they were still following before urging them onward with another soft bark and a flick of his head. He led them to a small, somber clearing dominated by two ancient, gnarled trees whose branches interlaced overhead like skeletal fingers, and there, nestled at their base, was a small, still form. Grace lay motionless on the cold, damp earth, her thin pink dress plastered to her tiny frame, her face a pale, ghostly white against the dark ground. Cooper immediately went to her side, nosing her gently, then positioning his large body as a partial shield against the lingering chill, a low, protective rumble vibrating in his chest. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, dear Lord!" She rushed forward, kneeling in the mud beside the child. Her fingers, trembling, fumbled at Grace's neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrifying second, there was nothing but the cold, clammy skin beneath her touch. Then, a faint, thready flutter. "She's alive, Dad!" Eliza cried, a choked sob of relief escaping her. "But she's so cold, so terribly cold. We have to get her home. Now, Samuel," his face etched with a mixture of pity and anger at whoever could have done this, carefully, tenderly, scooped the little girl into his strong arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bird. "Got her," he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's move." They made their way back to the farmhouse as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow, Cooper trotting close beside Samuel, his muzzle occasionally brushing against the man's leg as if to check on the precious bundle he carried. Each nudge was a silent inquiry, a display of unwavering concern. Inside the warm, familiar haven of the Monroe kitchen, the contrast to the cold, dark woods was stark. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee hung in the air. Eliza gently took Grace from her father and began the work of revival. She stripped off the wet, muddy dress with practiced, gentle hands, her heart aching at the sight of the child's thin, shivering limbs. Samuel, meanwhile, stoked the fire in the old cast-iron stove until it roared to life, casting flickering shadows and a welcome wave of heat across the room. Eliza found a soft, worn nightgown, one she had worn herself as a child, and carefully dressed Grace in it. She wrapped the little girl in a thick, woolen blanket and settled her onto the cushioned settle near the hearth. Slowly, as the warmth began to penetrate the chill that had gripped her, Grace's eyelids fluttered. She stirred, a small, whimpering sound escaping her lips. Her emerald eyes, large and luminous in her pale face, opened and darted around the unfamiliar room, finally settling on Eliza and Samuel. Fear, raw and stark, flooded into them. She shrank back against the cushions, her small body tensing, her breath catching in a series of tiny, frightened gasps. It was Cooper who broke the spell. He padded softly into the kitchen, his nails clicking quietly on the wooden floorboards, and approached the settle. With infinite gentleness, he laid his great head on Grace's lap and whined softly, his tail giving a tentative thump. Recognition flickered in Grace's eyes. This was a familiar presence, a source of comfort in her terrifying, silent world. Her Ramebs, thin and shaky, came up and encircled the dog's thick neck. She buried her face in his warm fur, and a tiny shudder ran through her, a release of some of the terror that had held her captive. The stark fear in her eyes softened, replaced by a weary bewilderment. Eliza knelt beside them, her voice a low, soothing murmur. "Hey there, little one. You're safe now. What's your name?" "Sweetie, can you tell me where you came from?" Grace looked at Eliza, her eyes wide and unblinking, but she offered no verbal response, no sign that she had even heard the gentle questions. Her gaze was distant, as if looking through Eliza rather than at her. Eliza continued to speak softly, trying to soothe the child with the tone of her voice, stroking her hair back from her forehead. As she did, her hand accidentally brushed against a heavy metal ladle hanging from a rack beside the stove. It clattered loudly to the stone hearth, the sound sharp and startling in the quiet room. Eliza winced, expecting Grace to jump or cry out, but Grace didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't turn her head, didn't even blink. Her gaze remained fixed on some distant point. A sudden, chilling realization dawned on Eliza. She looked up at Samuel, her eyes filled with a dawning understanding and a profound, aching sadness. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible, though the need for quiet seemed tragically ironic. "Dad, I think she can't hear. I don't think she can hear at all." Samuel's weathered face sagged. He nodded slowly, his own expression heavy with sorrow. He, too, had begun to suspect, noting the child's lack of response to their voices, to the sounds of the kitchen. The silence that enveloped Grace was not just of the world around her, but within her as well. Later, after Grace had drifted into an exhausted, feverish sleep, still curled against Cooper's reassuring bulk, Eliza examined the small, mud-stained duffel bag the dog had evidently dragged back with the child. It contained very little, a few more sets of things, cheaply made children's clothes, all slightly too small. A faded, well-loved cloth rabbit with one button eye missing, which Cooper sniffed at with an air of sad familiarity, nudging it with his nose, and absolutely nothing else. No identification, no note, no clue whatsoever as to who this silent, lost child was or where she belonged. The next morning, the storm had completely passed, though the sky remained a bruised, unsettled gray. The air in Redwood Creek felt charged, heavy with unspoken questions. Samuel, feeling the weight of their new responsibility, drove their old pickup truck into the small, nearby town to visit Mrs. Albright's general store. He needed to purchase some basic supplies for Grace. Softer food, suitable for a feverish child. Perhaps some children's Tylenol and a new toothbrush. Mrs. Albright, a woman whose physical stoutness was matched only by the breadth of her knowledge about local goings-on, was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose. She greeted Samuel warmly, but her usual cheerful prattle was tinged with an air of conspiratorial gravity. "Mr. Monroe, good morning to you, though it's the strangest of mornings. I must say," she began, leaning over the counter, "just yesterday, a rich fella, driving a shiny black car like something straight out of a movie, all polished chrome and dark windows. He came in here, dressed to the nines. He was asking, real quiet-like, if any lost children had been found in the area recently. Looked real important. You know, the kind with money and lawyers. But his eyes, Samuel, cold as ice, gave me the shivers. He did. Samuel listened intently, his face growing increasingly grim. Mrs. Albright wasn't finished. And that's not all. Not by a long shot. This morning, not an hour ago, two young fellas, city types, dressed sharp in those tight suits, but lookin' all shifty-eyed. You know, they were in here asking questions about the old Anderson family, specifically about Iris Anderson. God rest her soul, and any granddaughters she might have had. Even had the gall to ask about Iris's property. If it was all settled and such. Something don't feel right about any of it. Samuel, not right at all. Samuel's jaw tightened. The pieces, vague and unsettling, began to form a disturbing pattern in his mind. He told Mrs. Albright, in a low voice, about the little girl his family had found in the woods during the storm, omitting no detail of her condition or the apparent abandonment. Mrs. Albright gasped, her hand flying to her ample chest. Oh, that poor lamb, left out in that tempest. What kind of monster? Her eyes, usually twinkling with good humor, were now filled with genuine concern and a touch of fear. You be careful, Samuel, that little one. She might be in more trouble than just being lost. When Samuel returned to the farmhouse, his face was a mask of worry. He recounted Mrs. Albright's stories to Eliza as they sat at the kitchen table, the sleeping Grace still, small form on the settle nearby, Cooper, a vigilant guardian at her feet. The implications were chilling. It was clear, though the reasons remained shrouded in mystery, that Grace was not just a lost child. She was a target. Someone, perhaps multiple someones with conflicting and dangerous intentions, was looking for her. Eliza rose and went to the settle, gently stroking Grace's soft hair. She looked out the window at the brooding sky, then at Cooper, who met her gaze with a look of steadfast loyalty. A wave of protectiveness, fierce and profound, washed over her. This child, thrust so unexpectedly into their lives, was vulnerable, alone, and silent. In a world that was suddenly filled with unseen threats, she turned back to her father, her gentle face set with a new, quiet determination. We have to find a way to help her. Dad, she said, her voice low but firm. We have to protect her, whatever happens. Whoever comes looking, we can't let anyone harm her. We just can't. Samuel Monroe looked at his daughter, at the fierce maternal love already shining in her eyes for this lost child. He placed a calloused hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and shared resolve. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the path they were now on. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the quiet, predictable rhythm of their lives on the Monroe farm had just been irrevocably, and perhaps dangerously, altered. The next few days at the Monroe farm settled into a fragile routine, an oasis of quiet care centered around the silent child. Grace, though still pale and thin, began to mend. The persistent fever finally broke, chased away by Eliza's gentle nursing and the nourishing broths Samuel prepared. She remained timid, a small shadow who rarely strayed far from Eliza's side or the comforting, solid presence of Cooper. The big Labrador had become her constant companion, his quiet devotion a language she understood perfectly. She would often sit nestled against his warm flank, her small fingers absently twirling in his soft fur, her emerald eyes watching the world with a cautious, hesitant curiosity. The terrors of the storm-racked forest were receding, but a deep well of fear and uncertainty still resided within her. It was on a crisp, sun-drenched afternoon, with the scent of late-blooming roses heavy in the air, that the first formal challenge to their fragile peace arrived. A modestly expensive but well-maintained sedan crunched to a halt on the gravel drive. A man emerged, tall and slender, dressed in a neatly pressed tweed jacket and chinos that spoke of understated old money. His smile was polished, his manner smooth, but there was something in his eyes, a fleeting calculation, that put Eliza instantly on guard. "Mr. and Mrs. Monroe?" he inquired, his voice a cultivated baritone, as Samuel stepped out onto the porch, Eliza close behind him, Grace peeking shyly from behind Eliza's skirt. Cooper, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, rose to his feet, a low, almost inaudible rumble vibrating in his chest. "I am Samuel Monroe, and this is my daughter, Eliza," Samuel replied, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "A pleasure," the man said, extending a hand which Samuel shook briefly. "I am Marcus Thorne. I believe I am a distant cousin to young Grace's grandmother, Iris Anderson. I was so terribly distressed to hear about the circumstances, and I am incredibly grateful for your family's extraordinary kindness in taking care of Grace." He gestured towards the child, his smile widening. "I've come today, now that she's reportedly feeling a bit better, to ask to take her home with me. It seems I am her closest living relative with the means to provide for her appropriately. After all," he added, his voice softening with an assumed sincerity, "we're blood relatives. It's my responsibility, my duty, to care for her." Samuel and Eliza exchanged a quick, knowing glance. Mrs. Albright's warnings about shifty-eyed men asking after Iris Anderson and her granddaughters echoed in their minds. Thorne's smooth words, his air of concerned benevolence, felt rehearsed, hollow. "Mr. Thorne," Samuel began, his tone polite but firm, "we appreciate you coming all this way, and we understand your concern. However, Grace has been through a terrible ordeal. She's only just starting to recover. We feel it's best for her to stay here, where she feels safe. For the time being." Eliza nodded in agreement. "We also believe it's our duty to inform the proper child welfare authorities about Grace's situation. They will need to be involved in any decisions regarding her future." As she spoke, Thorne's gaze flickered towards Grace, and Cooper, sensing the subtle shift, took a step forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Eliza, the low growl in his chest becoming a fraction more audible. Thorne's smile didn't waver, but his eyes tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course," Thorne said smoothly, though a hint of impatience now laced his tone. "The authorities. Naturally, I merely thought to expedite things, family to family, as it were. But I understand your caution." He paused, then added, his smile now holding a certain enigmatic quality. "I shall make my own inquiries with the relevant departments. You can be sure I will be back, perhaps with those who have the proper authority to sort this unfortunate matter out." He gave a curt nod, retreated to his car, and drove away, leaving a residue of unease in the bright afternoon air. The encounter with Thorne left both Samuel and Eliza deeply unsettled. His veiled threat was not lost on them. Their respite, it seemed, was to be short-lived, and indeed it was. Not 2 days later, just as the supper dishes were being cleared, the arrogant growl of a powerful engine shattered the evening calm. A gleaming black limousine, ostentatiously out of place in the rustic setting of the Monroe farm, swept up the driveway and stopped with a disdainful sigh of hydraulics. The driver's door opened, and a uniformed chauffeur emerged. Hurrying to open the rear passenger door, Victor Beaumont stepped out, his expensive suit immaculate, his face a mask of cold impatience. He was followed by a smaller, older man in a severe dark suit, clutching a leather briefcase. Mr. Sterling, Victor's lawyer, his expression one of bored superiority. Victor Beaumont wasted no time on pleasantries. He strode towards the porch where Samuel and Eliza stood, a silent, united front. Grace, alerted by Cooper's sudden, sharp barks from inside the house, had crept to the screen door, her small face pressed against the mesh. "I don't have much time for this charade." Victor's voice was clipped, arrogant, accustomed to instant obedience. He didn't even glance at Grace. "I am Victor Beaumont. That child," he gestured dismissively towards the screen door, "is my daughter. Hand her over. Now, Mr." Sterling stepped forward, opening his briefcase with a snap. "We have documentation." "Mr. Monroe," he said, his voice dry as dust. A birth certificate clearly stating Mr. Beaumont as the father of one Grace. Beaumont. He produced a paper, holding it out. Samuel took it, his brow furrowed as he scanned the document. It looked official enough, but he had a farmer's shrewdness, a gut feeling for when things weren't quite right. Something about it, perhaps a missing seal or an oddly blank space for a mother's full details, felt incomplete. The confrontation on the porch was electric with tension. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows, and the air crackled. Eliza, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her at the sheer audacity and power radiating from Victor Beaumont, found her voice. Clear and strong, she stepped forward, placing herself slightly in front of her father, her eyes locking with Victor's cold, dismissive gaze. "You say she's your daughter?" Eliza challenged, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "Your own flesh and blood. Then tell me, Mr. Beaumont, why did you abandon her in the middle of Redwood Creek Forest, alone, in the dead of night, during a raging thunderstorm, a child as sick as she was?" Her words, each one a carefully aimed dart, hit their mark. A flicker of something. Surprise? Annoyance? Crossed Victor's composed features. What she needed was discipline, not coddling. Victor snapped back, his voice dropping to a dangerous, controlled level. "And how I choose to raise my child is none of your concern. You are illegally detaining her. We found her near death," Eliza retorted, her own anger rising. A father like that, a man who could do such a thing, doesn't deserve to get his child back. Victor's face darkened with fury. The mask of civility slipped, revealing the ruthless core beneath. "You backwoods hicks have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed, taking a menacing step closer. "Mr." Sterling placed a restraining hand on his arm. "I will have my daughter back, one way or another. And when I do, I will ensure you pay dearly for this kidnapping. You will regret the day you ever interfered in my affairs." He spun on his heel, Sterling scurrying after him, and they were gone. The limousine roaring back down the drive, leaving behind a palpable cloud of fear and the heavy weight of a very real threat. The encounters with Thorne and now Beaumont galvanized Eliza. The situation was escalating, becoming more dangerous and complex than they could have imagined. Grace needed more than just safety and comfort. She needed to be understood. Her silence was a wall, and Eliza knew they had to find a way to breach it, to hear her story, to understand the truth of her past. Her mind turned to Messrs. Evelyn Reed, a retired schoolteacher who lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town. Mrs. Reed had been Iris Anderson's dearest friend, a confidant for decades. More importantly, Eliza remembered hearing that Ms. Reed was proficient in sign language, having taught a deaf student many years ago. The next morning, Eliza found Mrs. Reed tending her vibrant rose garden. She was an elderly woman, her back slightly stooped with age, but her hands were deft among the thorns, and her eyes, when she looked up at Eliza's approach, were bright, kind, and remarkably astute. Eliza poured out the whole story, finding Grace, the child's silence and fear, the unsettling visits from Thorne, and the terrifying confrontation with Victor Beaumont. As Miss Reed listened, her gentle face grew increasingly grave. When Eliza spoke of Grace's deafness and her connection to Iris Anderson, Miss Reed's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my poor, dear Iris, Miss." Reed's voice was choked with emotion, her hand trembling as she reached out to clasp Eliza's. And her Lily. Such a tragic life she had. And now this little one, Grace, Iris's granddaughter, lost and alone. She looked at Eliza with a sudden, fierce resolve. "We must help her. Eliza, we must. I owe Iris that much. I owe it to her memory to protect her kin." That very afternoon, Ms. Reed arrived at the Monroe farm. Grace, initially wary of another stranger, hid behind Eliza. Cooper, however, after a thorough sniffing of Mitzi's, Reed's sensible shoes and gentle hand, seemed to approve, his tail giving a slow, welcoming wug. Miss Reed didn't rush. She sat quietly in the rocking chair, her presence calm and unthreatening. Then she looked at Grace, her eyes soft with compassion, and slowly, deliberately, her hands began to move. She signed, "Hello, my name is Evelyn. What is your name?" Grace's eyes, which had been downcast, flew open. She stared at Mrs. Reed's hands, her small face frozen in astonishment. Then, a light, a spark of pure, unadulterated joy, ignited within her gaze. It was as if a locked door, one she hadn't even realized existed, had suddenly swung open. Hesitantly, her own small hands began to move, forming tentative, almost forgotten shapes. With Ms. Reed's infinite patience, boundless love, and gentle guidance, Grace's story began to unfold. Over the next few hours, through the eloquent, surprisingly expressive dance of her small hands, Grace spoke. She told them of a happy, quiet life with her grandma Iris, a life filled with books and soft lullabies signed into her palms. She described Grandma's increasing weakness, the coughing fits, the sad look in her eyes. She signed about Grandma Iris writing a long, important letter, her brow furrowed with concentration. Then came the fear, the arrival of the angry-faced man, Victor. She signed the terror of the long, dark car ride, the confusing words she couldn't hear but felt as angry vibrations. And finally, with gestures that tore at their hearts, she depicted the cold, the rain, being left alone in the terrifying darkness of the forest. Her only comfort, the warm, solid presence of Cooper, who had refused to leave her. Eliza and Samuel watched, their hearts aching with a compassion so profound it felt like a physical pain. Miss Reed's own eyes were not dry. Tears streamed freely down her weathered cheeks as she translated Grace's silent, heartbreaking narrative. Later, as Grace, emotionally exhausted but strangely lighter, slept soundly in Eliza's old childhood bed, Eliza remembered the small duffel bag, rummaging through it again. Her fingers closed around a small, hard object tucked into a side pocket. An old, tarnished silver locket. She brought it to Miss Reed. Miss Reed took one look at it, and a gasp escaped her. "This was Iris's," she whispered, her fingers tracing the worn floral pattern on its surface. She never took it off. It was a gift from her own mother. Carefully, she pressed the tiny clasp. The locket sprang open, revealing a faded, miniature photograph on one side, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Lily, Iris's lost daughter, Grace's mother. On the other side, almost too small to discern, was a tiny, cherubic baby. The proof was undeniable. Grace was indeed Iris Anderson's granddaughter. That evening, Samuel, Eliza, and Ms. Reed sat around the sturdy kitchen table, the locket lying between them, a silent testament to a fractured family and a child's stolen heritage. The fight ahead of them, they knew, would be difficult, fraught with legal complexities and the ruthless determination of men like Victor Beaumont and the unknown machinations of Marcus Thorne. But as they looked at each other, a new strength flowed between them. an informal alliance, forged in shared compassion and fierce protective love, had been born. They would face whatever came, together, for grace. Victor Beaumont, true to his threat, wasted no time. Within days, a bewildered Samuel Monroe was served with a court summons, a crisp, official document that accused him and his daughter of unlawful detention of a minor. Simultaneously, Victor Beaumont formally filed a petition demanding sole custody of his daughter, Grace. The legal storm had broken, and the Monroes found themselves directly in its path. Mr. Sterling, Victor's attorney, a man whose slicked-back hair and razor-sharp suits seemed to mirror his predatory legal tactics, immediately went on the offensive. He was a master of procedural maneuvering, burying the Monroes' newly acquired and considerably less flamboyant local lawyer, Mr. Davies, under a mountain of motions and discovery requests. But Sterling's tactics weren't confined to the courtroom. An insidious whisper campaign began to circulate through the small, tight-knit community of Redwood Creek. Suddenly, tongues were wagging at the general store, over cups of coffee at the diner, and across picket fences. Heard the Monroes are trying to keep a rich fella's kid, one neighbor might say to another, their voice a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Funny business. If you ask me, wonder what their intentions really are, another would chime in. Someone said their farm's not up to snuff for raising a child. Not clean enough, you know. And old Samuel always seemed decent. But there are whispers about debts, hidden ones. Even Eliza wasn't spared. She's a young thing. That Eliza, the gossip would go, hardly more than a child herself. What experience does she have raising a deaf child? The rumors, baseless but persistent, were designed to chip away at the Monroes' reputation, to paint them as opportunistic, unfit, and perhaps even a little grasping. The Monroes, with the steadfast but admittedly resource-limited help of Mr. Davies, a man known more for his quiet integrity than his courtroom theatrics, struggled to mount a defense. Mr. Davies was honest and hard-working, but he was a small-town lawyer, unaccustomed to the cutthroat, high-stakes warfare waged by city firms like Sterling's. Ms. Evelyn Reed, however, proved to be an invaluable, indomitable ally. Not only did she continue to be Grace's voice, patiently translating the child's signed thoughts and fears, but she also threw herself into the fray with the energy of a woman half her age. She tirelessly contacted child advocacy groups, organizations supporting the deaf community, and anyone she thought might lend a sympathetic ear or offer practical assistance. Her small cottage became a makeshift command center, filled with correspondence and the scent of strong tea. Marcus Thorne, ever the opportunist, did not remain idle. He slithered back into the picture, attempting to play both sides against the middle. He approached Mr. Sterling with vague offers of useful information regarding Lily Anderson's past, information that could potentially embarrass Victor or complicate his custody claim, for a price. Of course, he then made similar, shadowy overtures to Mr. Davies, hinting that for a certain consideration, he might be willing to testify in a way that favored the Monroes, or, conversely, release damaging and likely fabricated or grossly exaggerated stories about Lily if his less than subtle requests for financial assistance were not met. His machinations only served to muddy the already turbulent waters, adding another layer of stress and uncertainty to the Monroes' plight. It was amidst this maelstrom of legal battles and insidious rumors that a new, formidable figure arrived in Redwood Creek. A different kind of luxury car, a stately, old-money Rolls-Royce, purred its way to the Monroe farm. From it emerged Victoria Beaumont, Victor's mother. She was a woman of imposing presence, impeccably dressed, her silver hair coiffed perfectly, her bearing radiating an aura of wealth, power, and unshakable self-assurance. She had come from the city, summoned by a carefully curated version of events from her son, who had painted himself as the aggrieved father, his beloved daughter cruelly and inexplicably withheld by a stubborn, uncooperative family of rural bumpkins. Initially, Victoria Beaumont maintained an air of cool, patrician distance. Her interactions with Samuel and Eliza were polite, but tinged with an unmistakable condescension. She firmly believed her son's narrative and viewed the Monroes with suspicion, assuming their motives were, at best, misguided, and at worst, mercenary. During her first formal visit, with Mr. Sterling hovering obsequiously at her elbow, she made her position clear. "Mr. Monroe, Eliza," she addressed them, her voice calm but carrying the weight of undisputed authority. "I understand your family has shown goodwill in looking after Grace. For that, we are, of course, grateful." Her gaze swept dismissively around the humble farmhouse kitchen. "However, Victor is the child's father, and we, the Beaumont family, are the only ones who can provide her with the life she deserves, the opportunities she is entitled to. I am prepared," she continued, opening an elegant alligator handbag, "to compensate you generously, Mr. Monroe, for any inconvenience or expense your family has endured, a substantial sum, to ensure there are no hard feelings. Then, we will take Grace home." The offer hung in the air, a clear indication that she believed everything, and everyone had a price. Samuel and Eliza politely but firmly refused her money, their quiet dignity a stark contrast to her imperious offer. However, Victoria Beaumont was not entirely without a heart, nor was she a fool. During that visit, and a subsequent one she made alone, driven by a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, she had the opportunity to observe Grace directly. She saw not the burden her son had vaguely alluded to, but a child of surprising charm and bright, intelligent eyes, a child whose silent world was nevertheless rich with expression. She witnessed the extraordinary, almost human-like devotion of Cooper, who rarely left Grace's side, his big head often resting in her lap, his presence a constant, reassuring comfort. Most significantly, Victoria saw the undeniable, unfeigned love that radiated from Eliza and Samuel towards the little girl. The gentle way Eliza brushed Grace's hair, the patient smile on Samuel's face as he watched Grace try to help him in the garden, the easy, natural affection that flowed between them. This was not the behavior of opportunists. It was Ms. Evelyn Reed who finally cracked the carefully constructed facade of Victoria Beaumont's certainty. Requesting a private audience, Ms. Reed spoke to Victoria not as a combatant in a legal dispute, but as one woman to another, one grandmother to another. With quiet, compelling emotion, Miss Reed recounted the entire tragic story Lily Anderson's youthful romance with Victor, his callous rejection upon learning of the pregnancy, the shame and hardship Lily had endured. She spoke of Grandma Iris's unwavering love and sacrifice, raising Grace alone in quiet dignity, her health slowly failing, and then, the final, brutal act, Victor's calculated abandonment of his own deaf child, a child he clearly viewed as an imperfection, a threat to his carefully crafted public image. To substantiate her words, Miss Reed produced a small, worn bundle of letters from Lily to Iris, filled with youthful hopes and later, heartbreaking despair. Letters from Iris to a distant cousin, detailing her struggles and her fierce love for her granddaughter. Victoria listened, her composure slowly crumbling as the weight of Mrs. Reed's words and the undeniable truth in those faded letters settled upon her. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her maternal loyalty. Over the next few days, Victoria Beaumont began her own discreet inquiries. She contacted old family friends, People who had known Victor and Lily during those early years. Her questions casual but pointed. The pieces of a very different story began to emerge. A narrative far uglier than the one her son had presented. She discovered the devastating truth Victor had known about Grace's existence for years. He had, for a time, provided a small, secret allowance to Iris, a pittance to keep her quiet and at a distance. But when Iris had finally, desperately, informed him of Grace's deafness, hoping for some measure of paternal support or medical intervention, Victor had cut off all contact, deeming the child a flawed liability, a potential embarrassment to his rising career and his carefully maintained social standing. He hadn't just abandoned Grace in the woods, he had abandoned her in his heart long before. An agonizing internal battle raged within Victoria Beaumont. The blind, instinctive love for her only son warred with the dawning, horrified recognition of his cruelty. The immense pride she held for the Beaumont name and its legacy clashed with the undeniable shame of his actions. And through it all, the image of Grace, her small, innocent face, her luminous, trusting eyes, the way her small hand had trustingly slipped into Victoria's own during a brief moment in the garden, haunted her waking hours and disturbed her sleep. Slowly, painfully, conscience began to prevail over ingrained maternal instinct and societal pride. Victoria looked at her own life, a life of privilege and ease, and then at the hard, loving life of the Monroes, and the innocent, vulnerable life of her granddaughter. She could no longer deny the truth, nor could she continue to enable or condone her son's profound moral failings. A decision, heavy but resolute, began to form in her mind. She had to do what was right, not for the Beaumont name, not for her son's ambition, but for Grace, for the little girl who deserved a champion, not another betrayal. The Redwood Creek Town Courthouse, a stoic, unassuming structure of weathered brick and sun-bleached paint, buzzed with an undercurrent of nervous energy. The day of the official custody hearing for Grace had arrived, and the small, makeshift courtroom, a converted municipal meeting room, was packed beyond its usual capacity. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable weight pressing down on all present. On one side, Victor Beaumont sat ramrod straight, his expensive suit a dark slash against the room's utilitarian decor. Beside him, his lawyer, Mr. Sterling, shuffled through a thick stack of documents with an air of practiced, almost bored confidence. Their strategy was clear, focusing with laser precision on Victor's biological rights as the father and his undeniable ability to provide a life of immense material advantage for the child. Across the aisle, the atmosphere was one of quiet determination rather than overt confidence. Samuel Monroe, his weathered hands clasped loosely in his lap, sat beside his daughter, Eliza, their local lawyer, and Mr. Davies, a man whose earnestness sometimes outweighed his courtroom polish, arranged his comparatively modest pile of notes. Ms. Evelyn Reed was seated next to Eliza, a reassuring presence, her hands ready to bridge the world of sound and silence for Grace, who was nestled between Eliza and Mrs. Reed. Cooper, after much gentle persuasion and a heartfelt plea from Eliza highlighting his role as Grace's emotional support, had been permitted to lie quietly at Grace's feet, his presence a calming anchor in the sterile room. The initial proceedings were a tense exchange of legal arguments. Mr. Sterling, with his sharp, incisive delivery, painted a picture of Victor Beaumont as a concerned father, ready and eager to provide his daughter with every conceivable advantage: elite schooling, world travel, a secure financial future. He subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, cast aspersions on the Monroes' ability to offer anything comparable, highlighting their modest means and the rustic simplicity of their farm. Mr. Davies, in response, spoke with heartfelt sincerity about the circumstances under which Grace had been found abandoned, ill, and terrified, he detailed the unwavering care and affection the Monroes had provided, the deep emotional bonds that had clearly formed. He called upon Mrs. Reed, who testified eloquently about Grace's deafness, her initial trauma, and the remarkable progress she had made in the stable, loving environment of the Monroe farm. Miss Reed also explained Grace's reliance on Cooper, describing the dog not merely as a pet, but as a vital therapeutic companion. Then came the pivotal moment. Mr. Dovies, his voice steady despite the gravity of the occasion, called his next witness the petitioner's mother, Mrs. Victoria Beaumont. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victor looked up sharply, a flicker of surprise crossing his otherwise composed features. He quickly masked it with a faint, almost condescending smile. He clearly anticipated his mother, despite her recent, somewhat unsettling inquiries into his past, would ultimately toe the family line, defend the Beaumont name, and support his claim. After all, blood was thicker than water, and the Beaumont legacy was paramount. Victoria Beaumont rose, a figure of quiet dignity and understated elegance. Her steps were measured as she approached the witness stand. As she took the oath, her eyes met Victor's. He saw not the unwavering maternal support he expected, but a profound, sorrowful resolve that sent an unexpected chill through him. This was not the script he had envisioned. What unfolded next stunned the courtroom into a breathless silence. Victoria, her voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining a resolute clarity with each word, did not defend her son. Instead, she systematically, and with heartbreaking precision, dismantled his carefully constructed narrative of concerned fatherhood. She produced irrefutable evidence copies of meticulously kept diaries from Iris Anderson, detailing Victor's initial brief involvement with Lily and his subsequent cold dismissal. Faded letters from Lily to Iris, filled with youthful hope that curdled into fear and then despair at Victor's rejection. Bank statements showing the sporadic, almost contemptuous sums Victor had sent to Iris, and then the abrupt cessation of those payments once he learned of Grace's deafness. She even had sworn affidavits from former acquaintances and distant family members who recalled Victor's callous dismissal of Lily and his later, chilling indifference to the existence of his child, whom he clearly viewed as a potential impediment to his ambitions. The culmination of her testimony was the stark, unvarnished truth about Grace's abandonment. Victoria recounted, her voice thick with emotion, what her own investigations had revealed about that stormy night, painting a damning picture of Victor's deliberate, calculated act of discarding his own daughter. As a mother, Victoria said, her gaze fixed on her ashen-faced son, her voice resonating with a profound and painful clarity. I stand before you today, admitting my own profound failure. I failed to instill in my son the basic tenets of compassion, integrity, and responsibility. Perhaps I indulged him too much, shielded him too often from the consequences of his actions. Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, never left Victor's crumbling composure. But as a grandmother, she continued, her voice gaining a steely, unwavering strength, I will not stand by and permit my granddaughter to suffer one more moment of injustice. I will not allow her life to be further damaged by deceit or self-interest. Victor, the name hung in the air, heavy with a lifetime of maternal disappointment. You have lied to this court. You have lied to your family. And most tragically, you have lied to yourself. You knew about Grace. You rejected her. And then, with a cruelty that I still struggle to comprehend, you abandoned your own flesh and blood in a desolate forest, fully prepared to let her perish. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by a stifled sob from Eliza. Victor sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror, the carefully constructed facade of his life shattering around him. Mr. Sterling rose, flustered, attempting to object, to discredit Victoria's testimony as the ramblings of an emotional, misguided woman. But the magistrate, a stern, no-nonsense woman, waved him down, her own expression one of grim understanding. Marcus Thorne, who had been lurking at the back of the room, hoping to exploit the situation for his own gain, seemed to visibly shrink. The magistrate made a pointed note on her pad, and it was clear Thorne's opportunistic schemes might soon attract a different kind of official scrutiny. Then, it was Grace's turn to speak, holding Mips, Reed's hand tightly, her small face serious but composed. Her eyes moved from the magistrate to Victor, and then to the Monroes. Through Mims, Reed's gentle, clear translation of her sign language, Grace's voice, though silent, filled the room with its innocent power. She expressed no bitterness, no childish desire for retribution. "I am not angry with my father, Miss," Reed conveyed, her own voice choked with emotion as Grace's hands moved with expressive grace. "My Grandma Iris. She taught me that forgiveness is important. She said it makes your heart feel better." Grace paused, her gaze settling on Eliza and Samuel, then dropping to Cooper, who nudged her knee with his head. "I just want to be with people who love me. I want to feel safe and happy. I want to stay here with Aunt Eliza and Uncle Samuel and my best friend, Cooper. This is my home." The simple, heartfelt honesty of the child, combined with the irrefutable weight of Victoria's evidence and perhaps, finally, the searing pressure of his own long-suppressed conscience, was Victor Beaumont's complete undoing. The fight visibly drained out of him. He slumped in his chair, a man stripped bare of his arrogance and power, the carefully maintained image of success and control dissolving into a portrait of profound moral failure. The magistrate's decision, when it came after a brief recess, was unequivocal. Full custody of Grace was awarded to Samuel and Eliza Monroe. Victor Beaumont was ordered to provide substantial and ongoing financial support for Grace's upbringing, education, and any specialized needs, with Victoria Beaumont appointed by the court to oversee the trust and ensure her son's compliance. Numbly, his face a blank mask of defeat, Victor signed the necessary documents presented by a grim-faced Mr. Sterling. He did not look at Grace, nor at his mother. He rose, and without a word, walked out of the courtroom, a solitary figure whose retreating back seemed to carry the immense weight of his disgrace and, perhaps, the very first, bitter stirrings of a long-overdue remorse. 1 year later, the Monroe farm breathed with a new, vibrant energy. A handsome, thoughtfully designed building now stood a short distance from the old farmhouse, its wide, welcoming porch overlooking rolling pastures. A beautifully carved wooden sign at the entrance of its driveway proclaimed it as the Redwood Creek Companion Center. This was a place born of love and a desire to heal, specializing in animal-assisted therapy and educational programs for children with unique challenges, with a particular focus on supporting deaf and hard-of-hearing youngsters. Its creation had been made possible by a generous foundational grant from Victoria Beaumont, who had found a new, quiet purpose in her granddaughter's world, and by the enthusiastic support of the Redwood Creek community. Ms. Evelyn Reed, her wisdom and compassion shining brighter than ever, served as its esteemed professional director, while Eliza Monroe, her innate warmth and gentle spirit finding their true calling, was one of its most dedicated and beloved teachers. Grace, now a confident and joyful 6-year-old, was the heart of the center. The transformation was remarkable. Her communication in American Sign Language was fluid and expressive. Her laughter frequent and infectious. She had become an invaluable junior assistant, her empathy and patience making her a favorite among the younger children. Her bond with Cooper remained unbreakable. The faithful Labrador, now a distinguished therapy dog with a touch of gray around his noble muzzle, was her constant shadow, the undisputed star of the center's animal therapy program, on a glorious autumn afternoon, the kind that set the Redwood Creek landscape ablaze with color. The center was celebrating its first anniversary. The air was filled with the scent of baking apples and the happy chatter of children. Victor Beaumont arrived quietly, parking his modest sedan at a discreet distance. He was a changed man. The sharp edges of his arrogance had softened. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now held a more contemplative, almost hesitant expression. He carried a small, thoughtfully chosen gift for Grace and a substantial envelope containing a donation for the center, which he presented quietly to Miss Reed. He didn't intrude on the festivities, but stood for a long while, observing. He saw Grace, radiant and animated, signing a story to a rapt group of younger children, Cooper lying contentedly at her feet. He saw his mother, Victoria, sitting on a bench, a genuine, peaceful smile gracing her lips as she engaged in an easy conversation with Samuel Monroe. He watched as Eliza lifted Grace onto a gentle pony, their shared laughter drifting on the crisp air. A wave of complex emotions washed over him. Regret, profound and sharp. A deep, aching sense of loss for the years and the love he had irrevocably squandered. And beneath it all, a strange, humbling flicker of gratitude. Grace eventually spotted him. For a moment, her playful expression faltered, a shadow of old memories passing through her eyes. Then, with a composure that belied her years, she signed something to Eliza, who nodded with a gentle smile. Grace walked towards Victor, Cooper trotting faithfully by her side. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze direct and unwavering. Then, with a small, dignified inclination of her head, she signed, "Thank you for coming to our party, and thank you for helping the center." Victor swallowed, a lump forming in his throat. You're welcome, Grace," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. It's a wonderful place." She gave him a brief, almost shy smile, then turned and ran back to rejoin the celebration, her loyal Cooper loping happily beside her. Victor watched her go, a profound sense of peace, tinged with an enduring sadness, settling in his heart. He knew he could never undo the past, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could contribute to a better future. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking hues of crimson and gold, Grace stood with Eliza, Samuel, Miss Reed, and Victoria on the porch of the Monroe farmhouse. Cooper leaned his great head against her leg. A comfortable, loving silence enveloped them. Grace looked up at the emerging stars, then at the faces of her cherished family. Her hands moved in a simple, eloquent gesture. "Love," she signed. "Family." 2 more years had woven themselves into the tapestry of life at Redwood Creek, each season adding depth and richness to the community that had rallied around a lost child and her loyal dog. Grace was now a bright, articulate 7-year-old on the cusp of 8. The tentative confidence of her earlier years had blossomed into a quiet self-assurance. Her fluency in American Sign Language was remarkable, her hands painting vivid stories and complex thoughts with an artist's grace. She navigated her silent world not as one confined, but as one who possessed a unique and beautiful way of connecting. The Redwood Creek Companion Center, under the steadfast guidance of Mrs. Evelyn Reed and the loving, hands-on dedication of Eliza Monroe, had flourished beyond anyone's initial dreams. It was no longer just a local sanctuary, but had begun to gain recognition in wider circles for its innovative animal-assisted therapy programs and its inclusive approach to children with diverse needs. Victoria Beaumont, a regular and cherished visitor, continued her generous patronage, but her involvement was now far more personal than financial. She found a profound, quiet joy in witnessing her granddaughter's growth and in being part of a community that valued compassion above all else. Samuel Monroe, though still running his farm with a capable hand, often found his greatest satisfaction in helping with the center's upkeep. His gruff exterior easily broken by a child's signed thank you or a happy nuzzle from one of the therapy animals. Cooper, now a venerable old gentleman of a Labrador, had gracefully transitioned into the role of elder statesman at the center. His muzzle was thoroughly silvered, his movements a little slower, his naps a little longer, but his heart remained as golden and devoted as ever. He was still Grace's most constant companion, his presence a comforting, familiar weight beside her, his wisdom and patience a gentle lesson to all. On a bright spring morning, the air sweet with the scent of lilac and freshly turned earth, the center was preparing for its annual Spring Fling, a day of open house, demonstrations, and community celebration. Grace, with an air of quiet responsibility, was helping Eliza set up a small obstacle course designed for the younger children and the smaller therapy animals. A miniature pony named Patches and a trio of fluffy Angora rabbits. Do you think? Grace signed to Eliza, her brow furrowed in concentration as she adjusted a brightly painted hoop. That Maya will try the course today. Maya was one of the center's newest arrivals, a painfully shy 6-year-old who had recently been diagnosed with selective mutism following a traumatic family event. She rarely spoke, and her interactions with others were minimal. Her small world contracted by fear. She had, however, shown a tentative interest in the animals, particularly the rabbits. Eliza smiled, signing back, "I hope so. Sweetie, maybe with your help. And Patches, she'll feel brave enough." Eliza had learned much from Miss Reed and Grace, and her signing, while not as fluid as theirs, was warm and expressive. Just then, a sleek, dark gray sedan, now a familiar sight, pulled quietly into the designated visitors' parking area. Victor Beaumont stepped out. The intervening years had continued their subtle work on him. The sharp, predatory aura was entirely gone, replaced by a more subdued, almost scholarly air. He still dressed well, but without the ostentation of his former life. He visited Redwood Creek regularly now, usually once a month. His visits were quiet, his interactions with Grace brief and respectful, never forced. He made no demands, offered no unsolicited advice. He simply came, observed, left a donation for the center, and sometimes, if Grace initiated it, shared a few signed words or a hesitant smile. His relationship with his mother, Victoria, had also found a new, more honest, if still complex, equilibrium.